What if an entire civilization did not collapse in fire or fall to invading armies, but instead vanished quietly through paperwork, renamed borders, and forgotten archives? What if the greatest erasure in human history happened not with explosions, but with signatures, stamps, and silent decisions? And what if traces of that lost world still surround us, hiding in plain sight? Before we go any further, write in the comments where you are watching from and whether you believe history always tells the full truth. If you are interested in hidden history, suppressed narratives, and mysteries that challenge everything we think we know, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. Your participation helps this investigation reach more minds. For centuries, maps across Europe and Asia displayed a vast region labeled Tartaria, sometimes called Great Tartary. It stretched across enormous territories, encompassing lands that today belong to multiple modern nations. Old atlases, encyclopedias, and official documents referenced it casually, as if its existence were unquestionable. Then, sometime in the early 1800s, something strange began to happen. Tartaria did not fall in a famous war. No decisive battle marked its end. No legendary siege burned its capital to the ground. There are no widely taught stories of heroic resistance or catastrophic defeat. Instead, Tartaria simply faded. Over the course of a few decades, its name disappeared from maps. References in textbooks quietly stopped. Government records were reorganized. Borders were redrawn. New administrative divisions appeared where an old civilization had once been acknowledged. Life, however, continued. People still farmed. Markets still opened. Families still raised children. Caravans still moved along ancient trade routes. The ordinary rhythms of daily existence showed no sign of sudden collapse. Which raises an unsettling question. How can something so large, so documented, and so widespread vanish without anyone noticing? The answer may lie not in military conquest, but in something far more subtle: administrative transformation. In the early 19th century, many empires were restructuring their bureaucracies. New census systems emerged. Taxation models changed. Regional authorities were replaced by centralized administrations. Legal codes were standardized. On the surface, these changes appeared technical, harmless, even progressive, but buried within these reforms was a powerful mechanism: the ability to redefine identity through paperwork. Regions were no longer described by traditional names. They were reassigned numeric districts. Cultural designations were replaced by imperial classifications. Local governing bodies were dissolved and rebranded under new titles. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. Instead, Tartaria was slowly absorbed into other entities piece by piece. One year, a province might be listed as an autonomous territory. The next, it became a district. A few years later, it was simply a region within an empire. And eventually, the word Tartaria stopped appearing at all. To future generations, it would seem as though it had never existed. Yet older maps tell a different story. Cartographers of the 17th and 18th centuries consistently marked Tartaria as a distinct entity, not as a myth, not as a rumor, but as a recognized geopolitical region. These maps were not created by fringe groups. They were produced by royal academies, state-sponsored institutions, and respected scholars. So why did later historians begin to treat Tartaria as nothing more than a vague label for unknown lands? One possibility is that history was streamlined. As new national identities were formed, older territorial concepts became inconvenient. Complex past structures did not fit neatly into the emerging narrative of modern nation-states. It was easier to simplify, easier to compress centuries of layered governance into a cleaner story, easier to remove inconvenient chapters than to explain them. But some researchers argue something more deliberate may have occurred. They suggest a coordinated effort to reset administrative memory, not through a single centralized conspiracy, but through a shared methodology adopted by expanding empires. Change the names, rewrite the categories, replace local records with standardized imperial archives, then allow time to do the rest. When a generation grows up without hearing a name, that name begins to feel fictional. When textbooks omit a civilization, students never question its absence. When museums no longer display its artifacts under their original identity, the past quietly reshapes itself. Tartaria did not disappear. It was refiled, reclassified, relabeled, and eventually forgotten. Yet anomalies remain. Architectural structures across vast regions share strikingly similar designs. Massive stone buildings appear in cities thousands of miles apart, built in styles that official history struggles to explain. Some of these structures are attributed to unknown builders. Others are said to be products of sudden technological leaps. But what if they are remnants of a once unified cultural sphere? What if Tartaria was not a single nation in the modern sense, but a loose federation of regions bound by shared systems of engineering, trade, and administration? If that were true, then erasing its name would not require destroying its people, only their historical identity. The early 19th century provided the perfect environment for such a transformation. Mass literacy was still developing. Centralized schooling systems were just beginning to take shape. Printed textbooks replaced oral tradition as the primary source of historical knowledge. Control the curriculum, and you control memory. By the middle of the century, most citizens had no reason to question why Tartaria was no longer mentioned. They had never been taught that it mattered. And so, an entire civilization slipped into the shadows of footnotes and obscure archives, not with a bang, but with a filing cabinet. And as we move deeper into this investigation, we will begin examining the mechanisms that made such a silent erasure possible, the institutions that benefited from it, and the unsettling patterns that suggest Tartaria's disappearance may not have been an isolated event, but part of something far larger, still unfolding. The idea of a silent erasure becomes even more unsettling when we examine how rapidly official historical narratives can change once administrative authority shifts hands. In many regions formerly associated with Tartaria, new governing bodies introduced fresh census categories. People who had once identified under traditional regional names were now registered under imperial classifications. Ethnic labels were replaced with broader, standardized terms. Local languages were discouraged in official contexts, replaced by state-approved tongues. On paper, these reforms were described as modernization. In practice, they dismantled identity. When a population no longer sees its historical name reflected in legal documents, that name begins to lose legitimacy. Over time, even the people themselves stop using it. This process does not require force. It requires repetition, school forms, tax records, birth certificates, property deeds. Each document quietly reinforces a new version of reality. Within one generation, the old identity feels obsolete. Within two, it feels mythical. Within three, it feels imaginary. Another curious detail emerges when comparing older and newer atlases. Early maps often depict Tartaria with internal subdivisions, cities, and trade routes. Later maps replace these with blank spaces, vague territorial shading, or new political borders that ignore previous structures entirely. This suggests not a lack of knowledge, but a reorganization of knowledge. Cartographers did not suddenly forget geography. They were instructed to draw it differently. Many 19th century mapping institutions were directly funded by imperial governments. Their purpose was not only to describe the world, but to define it in accordance with political priorities. If an empire wanted a region to be perceived as historically disconnected, one simple method was to remove its name from maps. Future scholars would then assume the region never had coherent identity. The absence itself becomes evidence. This is a powerful psychological mechanism. People tend to trust what is present, not what is missing. If Tartaria is not mentioned, it must not have existed. At least that is what we are taught to believe, but cracks appear when we examine early encyclopedias. Some editions printed in the 1700s contain extensive entries on Tartaria, describing its governance, customs, and geographic extent. Later editions quietly shorten or remove these entries altogether. No explanation is provided. No academic debate is recorded. The information simply vanishes. Such changes raise uncomfortable questions. Who decides which histories remain and which are discarded? Is history a record of what happened, or a record of what was permitted to be remembered? Another layer of mystery lies in architecture. Across Eurasia and even parts of the Americas, enormous stone structures exist that do not fit neatly into official construction timelines. Buildings with advanced masonry, symmetrical design, and massive foundations appear in places that, according to accepted history, should not have possessed the technology or resources to create them. Some are labeled as mud flood survivors, others are said to be repurposed ruins from unknown cultures, yet many share stylistic similarities across continents: columns, domes, grand arches, geometric ornamentation, What if these were not isolated achievements? What if they were products of a widespread building tradition connected to a civilization whose name was later erased? If Tartaria represented a network of regions sharing engineering knowledge, then its disappearance from records would not eliminate its physical footprint. The stones would remain, only their story would change. Consider also the strange gap in technological progression. Official history often portrays the early 1800s as a period of sudden industrial awakening. Cities expanded rapidly, infrastructure appeared almost overnight, massive projects were completed in surprisingly short timeframes. Railways, canals, public buildings. The explanation given is usually industrialization, but industrialization itself requires infrastructure. It requires prior knowledge. It requires skilled labor. Where did that expertise originate? What if it did not appear spontaneously? What if it was inherited from an older, unacknowledged system? Some researchers propose that rather than building from scratch, new regimes simply took control of existing structures and rebranded them as their own achievements, changed the plaques, rewrite the dedication dates, attribute construction to newer governments. Over time, the original builders fade into obscurity. This pattern mirrors what happened to Tartaria as a concept. The civilization was not destroyed. It was absorbed, redefined, and reassigned. Another unsettling pattern emerges in population records. In several regions, census data from the early 19th century shows abrupt changes in ethnic classifications without corresponding evidence of mass migration or genocide. Populations remain stable, but their labels change. This suggests administrative recategorization rather than physical displacement. People stayed where they were, only their identity shifted. When viewed collectively, these details form a disturbing picture, not of violent conquest, not of dramatic collapse, but of systematic forgetting, a slow-motion reset of collective memory, and once such a reset succeeds, reversing it becomes nearly impossible, because the proof still exists, but it is scattered, buried in forgotten archives, locked behind language barriers, ignored by mainstream institutions. As we continue, we will begin examining specific regions where Tartaria was once clearly documented and how their historical narratives were later rewritten in ways that follow the same pattern of erasure, suggesting a blueprint that may extend far beyond a single civilization. One of the most revealing aspects of Tartaria's disappearance is how consistently its former territories reappear under new historical identities. Regions once labeled as part of Tartaria are now taught as having always belonged to different empires, tribes, or kingdoms. The narrative shifts depending on modern borders, but the underlying pattern remains the same. The past is retroactively aligned with the present. For example, areas once described as autonomous Tartarian lands are now presented as ancient extensions of neighboring powers, even when older sources show no such subordination. This creates the illusion of continuity. It feels as though these regions were always part of today's political map, but older documents contradict this. They describe layered systems of governance, with local authorities operating under broader federative structures, not centralized empires, not fragmented city-states, something in between, a network. If Tartaria functioned as a decentralized federation, its strength would not have depended on a single capital or ruler. That makes traditional conquest ineffective. There is no head to cut off, no throne to seize, but such a system is vulnerable to administrative takeover. Replace local leaders with imperial appointees, standardize laws, integrate taxation. Within a generation, the old system becomes irrelevant. Within two, it becomes invisible. Another telling detail appears in language suppression. Many regions formerly associated with Tartaria experienced aggressive promotion of state languages in the 19th century. Local dialects were discouraged or ridiculed. Children were punished in schools for speaking them. Official business could only be conducted in approved tongues. Language is memory. When language dies, stories die with it. Genealogies become harder to trace. Oral histories fade. Names lose meaning. This creates ideal conditions for historical amnesia. Even if older people remembered Tartaria, their grandchildren would lack the words to understand what it meant. Architecture once again offers silent testimony. In numerous cities, large monumental buildings predate the official founding dates of the settlements they now occupy. The explanation given is often that early settlers built remarkably sophisticated structures immediately upon arrival. But this defies basic logistical reality. New settlements focus on survival, shelter, food, defense, not grand palaces and elaborate civic buildings. Those come later, unless they were already there. If newcomers simply inherited existing infrastructure, it would explain the sudden appearance of advanced cities in supposedly undeveloped regions. Rename the city, rewrite its founding story, attribute the structures to the new regime. The physical reality remains unchanged, only the narrative shifts. Another anomaly lies in disaster narratives. Some historical accounts describe massive fires, floods, and earthquakes across Tartarian regions during the late 1800s. These events are often framed as isolated local catastrophes, but when mapped together, they form a striking pattern, a chain of large-scale destructive events across vast territories within a relatively short time frame. What if these disasters were used as convenient reset points? After destruction, reconstruction offers opportunity. Records are lost, archives burn, buildings collapse. Rebuilding allows authorities to redefine layouts, rename streets, and establish new administrative frameworks, not necessarily orchestrated disasters, but opportunistic exploitation of chaos. If Tartaria's identity survived in local memory, disasters could accelerate its erasure. People struggling to survive are less concerned with preserving historical nuance. Their priority becomes rebuilding life, which makes them more receptive to new systems. Another uncomfortable question arises. Why is Tartaria almost never discussed in mainstream historical education? Not even as a debated theory, not as a mysterious footnote, simply absent. Silence is more effective than denial. When something is labeled controversial, people become curious. When it is ignored entirely, most never learn to ask. This may be the most powerful element of Operation Administrative Reset. Not forcing people to accept a false story, but preventing them from realizing a story ever existed. Yet, despite centuries of erasure, fragments remain. Old books, forgotten maps, strange ruins, inconsistent timelines. These fragments behave like fossils embedded in the layers of official history. They do not fit. They do not align. They quietly challenge. And as more independent researchers begin comparing these anomalies, a larger pattern starts to emerge. Not proof in the courtroom sense, but convergence. Different lines of evidence pointing toward the same unsettling possibility. That Tartaria was real, that it was extensive, and that its disappearance was not an accident, which leads to the most disturbing implication of all. If a civilization of such scale could be erased without open war, if its memory could be dissolved through administrative processes, then history itself may be far more malleable than we are taught, and Tartaria may not be the only chapter missing from the human story. When examining who benefits from a rewritten past, certain patterns begin to surface. Emerging empires of the 19th century were engaged in aggressive expansion, both territorially and ideologically. To justify control over vast regions, they needed historical legitimacy. It is easier to rule land if you can claim it has always been yours. If Tartaria existed as a recognized entity, then annexing its territories would appear as conquest. But if Tartaria never existed, then those same territories can be framed as ancestral lands, rightful inheritances, or naturally integrated regions. Narrative determines morality. History becomes a legal document. Another revealing factor is the synchronization of educational reforms. During the same period that Tartaria vanished from maps, many nations standardized school curricula. Previously, education varied widely by region. Local histories were taught. Community traditions were preserved. With standardization came uniform textbooks, uniform interpretations, uniform timelines. Once centralized authorities controlled what children learned, alternative versions of the past slowly died out. Not because they were disproven, but because they were never presented. Consider how fragile memory truly is. Most people know history only through what they were taught in school. Very few read primary sources. Fewer still compare multiple editions of old texts. If a detail is removed from textbooks, it effectively ceases to exist for the majority of the population. This creates an environment where administrative decisions shape collective reality. A file clerk removing a paragraph, an editor shortening an entry, a ministry approving a revised textbook. Each action feels insignificant. Together they restructure civilization's memory. Another anomaly involves cartographic recycling. Many later maps appear to be based on earlier plates, but with certain labels carefully altered. Borders remain similar. Geography remains consistent. Only names change. This suggests deliberate editing rather than fresh surveying. Why redraw what already works? Because the goal was not to change the land, it was to change its identity. Some researchers have noted that in several languages, the word Tartaria gradually became associated with chaos, barbarism, or undefined wilderness. This linguistic shift reframes the term from a legitimate geopolitical identity into a vague descriptor. Once that happens, removing it becomes easier. Why keep a word that supposedly never meant anything precise? But older sources contradict this. They use Tartaria with specificity. They list subdivisions, they describe governance, they refer to rulers. This inconsistency points toward retroactive reinterpretation. Another layer involves museums. Artifacts discovered in regions once labeled as Tartarian are now typically attributed to later cultures. The dating methods used often rely on contextual assumptions. If an artifact is found in a region now defined as belonging to a certain empire, it is automatically categorized under that empire's history. The possibility that it belongs to a pre-existing civilization is rarely explored. Assumptions shape conclusions. Conclusions shape exhibits. Exhibits shape public understanding. Over time, the alternative becomes unthinkable, yet cracks continue to appear. Private collectors sometimes possess books that contradict mainstream narratives. Small regional archives contain documents that were never digitized. Marginal notes in old volumes reference Tartaria casually, as though its existence were obvious. These fragments do not prove a single unified theory, but they challenge the completeness of the official story. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this: Operation Administrative Reset may not require coordination in the way people imagine conspiracies. It does not require a secret council meeting in a dark room. It only requires aligned incentives. Empires benefit from simplified histories. Governments benefit from controllable narratives. Institutions benefit from continuity. No single villain is necessary. The system itself performs the erasure. Once set in motion, it sustains itself. Future historians build upon earlier textbooks. Editors reference previous editions. Mistakes become tradition. Tradition becomes truth. Which raises a final question for this segment. If Tartaria could be erased through bureaucracy, education, and time, what other civilizations might have shared the same fate, and what might still be disappearing today, quietly, while the world goes about its business, unaware that another chapter of human history is being rewritten in real time? To understand how easily a civilization can be erased, it is necessary to examine how people interact with information in everyday life. Most individuals do not question official records. Birth certificates, passports, school diplomas, property deeds, these documents feel permanent, authoritative, objective, but they are only as truthful as the system that produces them. If a system changes its definitions, reality changes with it. Imagine being born into a world where Tartaria no longer exists on paper. No document mentions it. No teacher references it. No museum labels use the term. Even if your grandparents once used the word, it would sound like folklore, an old story, not history. Over time, social pressure reinforces conformity. People who question official narratives are dismissed as eccentric or misinformed or dangerous. This discourages open discussion. Silence becomes self-policing. Another important factor is the destruction and consolidation of archives. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, countless local record offices were closed. Documents were transferred to centralized repositories. Many were deemed redundant. Others were lost. Some were deliberately discarded. When archives shrink, history shrinks. What remains defines what is considered legitimate. Everything else becomes rumor. This process does not require mass burning of books. It only requires selective preservation. Keep what supports the new narrative. Neglect what complicates it. Over decades, neglected documents deteriorate. Ink fades. Paper crumbles. Eventually, they are gone. Physical decay completes what administrative policy began. Another pattern emerges in genealogy. In many regions once associated with Tartaria, family histories become increasingly difficult to trace beyond a certain point in the early 1800s. Records suddenly become sparse. Names change spelling. Lineages appear to begin abruptly. This is often blamed on poor record-keeping, but poor record-keeping does not explain systematic gaps across vast territories. Administrative restructuring does. When new authorities take control, they often establish new baseline records. Earlier documents may be ignored. People become officially born into the new system, even if their families have lived there for centuries. Their recorded history begins where the new administration begins. Everything before becomes unofficial, invisible. This reinforces the illusion that nothing significant existed earlier, yet physical evidence contradicts this. Ancient roads, bridges, water systems, foundations buried beneath modern streets. These are not the products of spontaneous settlement. They reflect long-term planning, large-scale coordination, inherited infrastructure, but without an acknowledged civilization to attribute them to, they become anomalies, labeled as mysteries, or attributed to vague ancient peoples, which conveniently prevents deeper questions. Some theorists propose that Tartaria represented a high-functioning network society, not necessarily advanced in the modern technological sense, but highly organized, efficient, capable of coordinating large projects across great distances. Such a society would leave behind extensive infrastructure, even if its political identity were erased. This would explain why remnants appear everywhere, yet are claimed by no one. Another uncomfortable observation involves symbolism. Certain motifs appear repeatedly across regions once associated with Tartaria: geometric patterns, star-like designs, architectural proportions. These motifs are often labeled decorative, but repetition across thousands of miles suggests shared meaning, shared culture, shared origin. If Tartaria's name was erased, its symbols would remain, stripped of context, turned into aesthetic choices rather than cultural statements, which again benefits erasure. Beauty without history is easy to admire. Beauty with history invites questions, and questions threaten established narratives. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: erasure does not feel like erasure while it is happening. It feels like progress, modernization, standardization, efficiency. People welcomed new systems because they promised stability. Few suspected that something precious was being lost. Not land, not wealth, not even freedom in an obvious sense, but memory, collective memory. Once memory is gone, control becomes effortless, because people cannot defend what they do not remember. And as we approach the final segment, we will examine what the survival of Tartaria's traces means for us today, and why rediscovering suppressed history may be one of the most important acts of resistance in the modern world. The survival of Tartaria's traces presents humanity with a quiet challenge: not to immediately accept any single alternative narrative, not to replace one official story with another, but to recognize that history is not a finished product. It is a living construct, shaped by power, shaped by institutions, shaped by what is preserved and what is allowed to decay. If Tartaria once existed as a vast network of cultures and regions, then its disappearance demonstrates something profound. Civilizations do not need to be destroyed to be conquered. They only need to be forgotten. This realization changes how we interpret the past. It also changes how we view the present, because the same mechanisms that erased Tartaria are still in use today. Administrative restructuring, educational standardization, digital archiving controlled by centralized authorities, information filters, algorithmic prioritization. What is visible becomes real. What is hidden becomes irrelevant. Future generations will know only what remains accessible, which means that every decision about what to preserve carries enormous weight. Another important implication emerges. If Tartaria was absorbed rather than annihilated, then its descendants are not gone. They are us. The bloodlines continued, the cultures blended, the traditions fragmented, identity shifted, but people endured. This reframes Tartaria not as a lost civilization in the distant past, but as an ancestral layer beneath modern society, an invisible foundation. Understanding this does not require abandoning established history. It requires expanding it, allowing space for complexity, for contradictions, for unanswered questions. True historical inquiry is not about comfort. It is about honesty. Even when honesty is unsettling, The possibility that entire chapters of human civilization can be erased without public awareness should disturb us, not because it proves a specific theory, but because it reveals a vulnerability in how knowledge is transmitted. We trust systems because we must. No individual can personally verify all of history, but trust should never replace curiosity. Curiosity is the safeguard, the quiet force that prevents total amnesia. Every old map examined, every forgotten book reopened, every anomaly questioned. These acts may seem small, but collectively they resist oblivion. Perhaps Tartaria's greatest legacy is not its architecture, not its territory, not even its political structure. Perhaps its legacy is the lesson its disappearance teaches, that memory is power, and whoever controls memory shapes reality. So the next time you look at an old building and feel that it does not quite fit the story you were told, the next time you see a map that contradicts a textbook, the next time you notice a historical gap that seems too convenient, pause, not to jump to conclusions, but to ask better questions. Because history does not belong solely to institutions, it belongs to those who are willing to seek it. And maybe, just maybe, Tartaria was never meant to stay hidden forever. Maybe its story persists precisely because enough fragments survived, enough to whisper, enough to provoke doubt, enough to remind us that the past is far larger, stranger, and more complex than we were taught. And in that realization lies something powerful, not fear, not paranoia, but responsibility. The responsibility to remember, the responsibility to question, the responsibility to protect humanity's collective memory from quiet erasure. Because once a civilization is forgotten, it is not only the past that is lost, it is part of our future as well.